Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the Sonim XP Pro 5G. This is a rugged Android smartphone, acting as a pretty interesting mid-range option for folks in the US. It can be found for $200 with a 2-year contract with Verizon. And as a military-specified rugged device, it's going to be drop-proof, shock-proof, waterproof, and also you can use it in extreme weather conditions, up to negative 20 degrees Celsius. And the screen remains responsive even if you're wearing a glove for folks working in construction or in more extreme weather conditions. And all of this is wrapped in a relatively compact and slim design for a rugged phone, that is, compared to many of the previous devices that we've seen in a similar category from brands like Kyocera, Doogee, as well as Unihertz Umidigi devices. All tend to be substantially thicker as a rugged phone, making it a little harder to appeal to the masses. Compared to this Sonim XP Pro is surprisingly not bad. It's similar to a regular phone that maybe has just a rubber case. For example, here's a Google Pixel device just as comparison with a aforementioned TPU case. You can see it's actually not too far apart. The phone further sports wireless Qi charging support. So if you have a wireless charging pad, you can pop it on here to quickly top it up. Another feature that is a little harder to find on budget and mid-range phones in the past, so good to see it here, although you can still rely on standard USB Type-C charging underneath a rubber flap here at the bottom. Charging speeds, though, are just average. You get 18 watts with wired and also 15 watts with the wireless charging, and that is topping up the 5,000 milliamp hour capacity battery inside in around an hour and a half. A couple of other top-line specs include a nearly 6.6-inch IPS LCD, Full HD Plus resolution screen that is 90 Hz. It's further complemented with 8 GB of RAM and using the Qualcomm Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 processor inside. This should be a relatively energy-efficient 5G-enabled 4nm processor built on TSMC manufacturing facilities, achieving roughly 800,000 on Antutu 10 benchmarks. So even though it's not going to be the flagship processor compared to the latest gen chips like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, for example, it's actually comparable to some older flagships from a couple of years ago, including the Snapdragon 865, for instance, actually scores very similarly these days when it comes to the CPU and the GPU performance. In fact, the 7 Gen 3 here actually comes out a little bit on top, which is impressive. Of course, synthetic benchmarks are one thing, but in real-world performance, this still translates to a pretty zippy experience when it comes to navigating around the UI, and doing most tasks on the phone still feels relatively fast and fluid. The device also comes with 256 GB of built-in storage that can be supplemented with a micro SD card to augment additional 1 to 2 TBs of space. It's currently running on Android 14 out of the box, by the way, with 2 additional major OS updates promised by Sonim, which is based in San Diego here in the United States. Now, interestingly, the phone also supports eSIM capability along with a standard nano SIM card slot. So that is going to be a virtual SIM that you can download if you're traveling internationally. So also if you're going to the beach, for example, or you want to just dunk this thing in the ocean, take some photos of marine life and fish, you can do that without needing to worry about a case. When it comes to the cameras, there's a 16 megapixel front-facing one built into this teardrop notch, as well as on the back you have access to a 50 megapixel main camera, assisted by a 13 megapixel ultra-wide-angle lens, as well as an LED flash, and there's also a 2 megapixel macro lens for close-up shots. Now, I've said this time and time again, but I do find the macro lens to not be the most practical setup in the world. Would have really preferred a telephoto zoom lens instead if they're going to put another sensor on here. Perhaps one use case, though, is if you're taking images of components like screws. Things are really small. If you are working in construction, it might be handy, as well as perhaps improving on the bokeh mode when it comes to depth sensing when taking images with the primary lens. And yes, you can record 4K video footage using that primary sensor as well, which we'll dive into a little bit more later in this video. A couple of other notable specs include the loudspeaker. It is a mono speaker, unfortunately, so there is no stereo setup, which would have been even better, but it does get very loud and it's rated to be over 100 decibels. So in an emergency, if you're using it as a siren or alarm, it can also be heard more clearly. Now, aside from the super grippy rubber finish on the phone, Sonim have also built in a couple of hardware keys on the side of the device that we don't typically see in a normal Android smartphone. For example, there's a push-to-talk walkie-talkie button, which is compatible with cell phone services, including Verizon here in the States. And so under eligible plans, you're able to use it like a walkie-talkie, long pressing and then releasing to speak to someone on the other end that also has a Sonim device. Kind of unique, although it's still technically sending the information using cellular connectivity as compared to radio that you have on a traditional walkie-talkie. And aside from this key, there is another one located on the very top of the phone that can be reprogrammed to trigger other shortcuts or commands. For instance, right now I have it set up to automatically open up the voice recorder, but under device settings and programmable keys, you can select that to do something else. So that is the emergency key, although you have to reach a little bit taller on the very top of the phone. However, maybe that's purposeful since you don't want to be accidentally triggering that if not in an emergency. With that being said, newer Android versions have improved on safety and accessibility functions. For example, on current-gen devices, you can actually long hold on the power key to now bring up additional menus like a emergency functionality, calling the police or sending your location. So you don't necessarily have to use that dedicated emergency key necessarily these days, but I guess it never hurts to have an extra button that you can reprogram to do other things. Similarly, the walkie-talkie button can also be reprogrammed as well, including a single press compared to a long press can trigger different actions. That does mean though that the volume rocker has been placed a little bit lower compared to a traditional device to make room for that walkie-talkie button, which is one aspect that did require a little bit of getting used to. However, these buttons are sculpted and they're very tactile and responsive, easy to click on. Final look at the hardware, there's just a lanyard slot at the very top, also kind of rare to see in phones these days. And even more interestingly, on the right-hand edge, there is another port that you can access by removing these screws. There's a kind of pogo contact system compatible with Sonim's secure audio devices. So you can actually plug in an analog kind of walkie-talkie style receiver, as well as any wired headsets, giving it a really industrial, tactical look. Again, if you're working in construction or in certain industries, this might make it easier to communicate with lower latency. Of course, there is still the normal Bluetooth 5.3, as well as Wi-Fi, GPS built on in, NFC as well are all on board. Down below here, you'll also find a power key that is integrated with the fingerprint scanner, which has worked flawlessly in my testing so far. The most gentle of taps will unwake it pretty much 10 out of 10 times. Last but not least, on the back of the phone, even though it's nothing super flashy, it's again pretty easy to grip thanks to that rubber finish. And I like the fact that the camera bump here is very minimal. It's almost completely flat when you're setting it down onto a table. It's really not going to wobble around. Plus, you'll find two more pogo contacts that can be used in an optional cradle. It doesn't come with the default packaging, but you can use this instead to pop it into that dock and charge it if you don't want to use the Type-C or the wireless charging. There is a third way of charging up the phone. So it is a pretty interesting or unique hardware package with all of these extra connectors and ports that we really seldom see these days. Very discreet and understated presentation, but comfortable enough to hold. Now, maybe one downside though of having this slimmer design is the battery cover is no longer removable as compared to some of the previous generation Sonim phones, which were perhaps a little bit more easily repairable in that sense, or if you wanted to pop in another battery as backup, unfortunately it's no longer possible here with the unibody build. So kind of a give and take situation there. Sonim also touts a 3-year comprehensive warranty here, so if anything breaks, they will repair it for you, along with offering pretty comprehensive support using an app installed on the phone called Sonim Care. There is a digital support client built on in. And compared to many of the previous devices from this brand, I would say maybe the most notable difference on this device is going to be that 5G connectivity. That being said, to the average consumer, perhaps they don't really care about 5G all that much, but if you are in a location that is supporting the growing network, you'll be able to get a little faster internet connectivity. A quick start guide, charger, as well as Type-C cable are also included in the package. So overall, as a rugged phone, I think this one has a pretty comfortable and discreet design, very easy to grip and actually use. Also, interestingly enough, Sonim have come out with another XP Pro thermal, although this one hasn't officially hit the shelves yet, with the biggest difference being the presence of a thermal imaging camera instead. So if you want the specialty sensor built into your phone, if you're working in construction, trying to look at different heat maps, also kind of seeing in the dark of areas that are hot versus cold, you can opt for this device instead, holding out for a little bit longer. It has also a slightly different design for the camera bar that kind of reminds me of a Google Pixel device, but not in a bad way. Now again, this screen I think looks relatively good when it comes to sharpness as well as viewing angles, thanks to the IPS nature, getting decently bright in most conditions. Of course, if you are outdoors in glaring sunlight, it may still struggle a little bit more versus the latest flagships, but ultimately not bad. And also located on the very top is going to be an ambient light sensor as well as the earpiece. Software-wise, you get a very clean version of Android that hasn't been really tampered by Sonim. I think that's a good thing. So there is minimal bloatware. You have all the Google Essentials pre-installed here, including the Chrome browser, access to the Play Store, of course, and the typical drag-up notification tray, as well as a newsfeed here on the left of your home screen. Minor additions built by Sonim, though, include a flashlight widget, which also has kind of an interesting animation there. You can tap to turn it on and off pretty easily. In fact, they also have their version of Motorola's Chop Chop gesture, where you can kind of flick the phone twice very quickly to turn on the flashlight and then flick again to turn it off. Furthermore, Sonim also has another function here called Stealth Mode, and there's a widget that you can tap on to turn it on or off. And you can think of this as a more customizable mute switch or do not disturb mode. And so with a single click, you're able to change the screen brightness, changing the volume also for different types of notifications. So you can trigger this as kind of a quick profile toggle on the device to reduce distractions and then turn it off again when you're done. Now, one aspect of the settings, though, that's a little bit strange is even though it touts a 90 Hz refresh rate on the specs listed with GSM Arena, but if I go over to the display properties, you're not able to actually change the refresh rate to lower it to standard 60 Hz to consume less power or customize it, unlike most other phones. So I kind of wish they would add in that control in the settings, maybe in a future software update. What you do have here, though, is the ability to change the color profile from a more boosted versus natural, as well as adaptive, changing the saturation just a little bit more. Otherwise, taking a quick look at the camera next, historically, rugged phones have put photography more on a back burner and focus on other elements instead, like the build, but on here I would say it's an average experience. No, it's not going to beat the latest iPhone or Pixel device, but it's also far from a shabby experience. The UI is relatively clean, and you can turn on and off functions like HDR, as well as an AI scene detection mode for increasing contrast if you're taking photos of plants in nature, for example, versus portraits. And from here, you're able to toggle back and forth between the primary versus the ultra wide angle lens at a snap, and also a 2x digital crop on the main sensor. There is no dedicated telephoto lens though. So again, zooming in further from this point will lose out a little bit more in detail. There's also Google Lens integration for scanning and barcodes, as well as you can toggle into other profiles like the portrait aka bokeh mode, a separate tab here to capture at the full 50 megapixel resolution, although it will turn off functions like HDR processing if you're capturing here. The macro lens camera, panorama, time-lapse features are also tucked away under more functions. And then from the left here, you can also access video recording, a pro mode, which allows to adjust properties like ISO, white balance yourself, and also a night mode that will expose the shots for a little bit longer to let in more light as it's capturing a shot, as long as you're holding relatively still. Furthermore, Sonim even has a couple of additional filters for beauty effects, smoothing out the skin, and a couple of preset filters that you can play with instead of using it in post. This can change the kind of color, temperature of your shots, playing around with some more creative composition if you're looking for that. Some final software features here include correcting the ultra wide angle lens's distortion, as well as a smile detection and smile capture mode. So reviewing some of the sample images, I would say that again, it's not bad. It's definitely not going to be quite as consistently outstanding compared to, again, more flagship grade smartphones on the market, but you can get relatively sharp looking results thanks to that 50 megapixel sensor. Capturing some of the flowers here actually still looks quite good. Colors are definitely on the more vibrant side, providing a little bit more pop and contrast with these shots in perhaps a Samsung inspired way. And although Sonim haven't explicitly stated what their specific sensor size behind the camera lens is, it does seem to be a little bit larger versus, again, past budget and mid-range phones. So I think it is somewhat helping in producing a little bit better looking results when it comes to having some natural bokeh there in the background. HDR here also seems to be doing a decent job of still having some of the background clouds in the sky exposed along with the leaf here up front. So you get the idea. Definitely not a bad camera, I would say, for a device like this. Here's also an example of an indoor shot, and this first one is captured at the full 50 megapixels, compared to the second one here is in the regular photo mode, which has been to 13 megapixels, with AI and HDR turned on. You can tell that it's capturing a slightly more bright looking result, colors a bit more saturated, versus the 50 megapixel one is a little bit more dark. However, one benefit is you can zoom in much further if you're using the full 50 megapixel sensor here. You get up close here to the frame versus the same shot here. You can see you can zoom in this much if you're capturing in the standard 13 megapixel mode, even if shadows and details with HDR might be slightly better represented. So you can pick and choose, although the 50 megapixel profile will take up more space, around 8 megabytes, versus on the regular around 2.7 megabytes. Also playing around with some of the filters built into the camera, it's also not bad. So for example, this is kind of what the default camera looks like as you're snapping a shot, compared to this one is a more muted, slightly flatter color profile versus this one is the vibrant color profile that cranks up the saturation even more. So all of this is done as you're taking the photos using the built-in filters as compared to editing it later on. So we've reached a point with smartphone cameras that even on slightly less expensive devices, it's honestly not shabby anymore. Now when it comes to web browsing performance, again, the Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 is doing quite well. Reception strength has been actually pretty solid with both Wi-Fi as well as 5G here in the Seattle region. And that means staying connected is generally not going to be a problem. Also, loading up web pages even on more complex sites like The Verge remains a very snappy experience. Along with 8 GB of RAM, I would say you can open up dozens of tabs in the browser, hop around, and not really worry about performance being an issue. And similar remarks there when it comes to the reception for making calls, didn't have too many problems. Now here's also a test of the microphone and built-in speaker. Quick test of the microphones, how does it sound? 1, 2, 3. So actually relatively clean when it comes to the microphone, and the speaker does a decent enough job as well. It doesn't distort too much or sound overly shrill even at the higher volume levels. It's just a little bit of a shame when it comes to entertainment that we don't have a stereo speaker that would have been, again, even more immersive. But speaking of, here's a quick demo of it playing back video. So indeed gets relatively loud, and I guess one benefit here is since there are 2 grills at the bottom, as you're covering up one of them, the other one still allows sound to pass through, even if it's not going to be as balanced as having the earpiece also act as the second speaker. However, when it comes to loading up video clips, and again the screen in general as an IPS LCD panel still looks relatively vibrant, and videos are playing back relatively smoothly as well without too many interruptions or problems. So it very rarely gets warm at all, even as I'm pressing it harder through multitasking. The entire thing still remains pretty much cool to the touch. That being said, maybe this is down to optimization, but I was expecting the 7 Gen 3 to be a little bit stronger when it comes to battery endurance. Yes, the phone remains smooth and cool during operation, but with the 5000 mAh capacity pack, I was averaging around a day to a day and a half before I needed to recharge it again, which, don't get me wrong, it's still pretty decent, but I was seeing maybe around 4% power drain overnight, and for the 7 Gen series processors and 6 Gen chips, I usually expect to see maybe just 1 or 2%, although perhaps another culprit is going to be the 5G modem also using up a little bit more juice. So maybe offering some additional power saving menus would be nice to see down the road. Also, again, the software experience is really Spartan and clean, but maybe that's to a fault, because on almost all of the other rugged phones that I've seen previously, there have been a couple of toolbox utilities, giving you access to a built-in compass feature, barometer, leveling tool, so on and so forth, that could have been handy for folks seeking those extras on a device like this. You can always find your own alternatives by downloading it from the Google Play Store, but it's one extra step that I think could be worth considering adding on since it is a rugged phone. And a closer look at that aforementioned Sonim Scout software, you can find some security functions here, and under utilities, control the stealth mode functionality as well as activate call screening. So you can whitelist or block certain numbers as well as text messages, as well as contact support in the final tab over here. So even though there is a slightly larger bezel, of course, at the very bottom of the chin versus a more modern flagship, I wouldn't say it's that obtrusive and perhaps adds to the durability of the device a little bit more. And the screen, by the way, is protected using Corning's Gorilla Glass Victus 2, so it should be pretty resistant to scratching as well as impact and damage. And really, last but not least, when it comes to some additional third-party apps, such as gaming, social media, you can of course also install those and run them from the Play Store really without any problems. As we touched on earlier, with CPU and GPU performance even a little faster than the Snapdragon 865 flagship from a couple of years back, you can still expect relatively smooth frame rates as you're opening up the majority of titles from the Play Store. As you can tell here in this example, loading along here just fine. Again, the phone still remains pretty cool as you're using it for even extended durations. The grip here also remains quite comfortable, so you shouldn't feel constrained constrained by the processing power in here. Granted, if you are a competitive gamer looking for the fastest frame rates 24/7 on even more demanding AAA style games like PUBG or Asphalt, then you'll be better off with a true flagship grade device that has a, again, 8th Gen series or even 8 Elite processor for the best of the best. But this is certainly not shabby. For the vast majority of folks out there, I would say it's more than sufficient. So there we have it. That's been a closer look at the Sonim XP Pro 5G. And honestly, I come away a little bit more impressed with this device than I was expecting. Because again, we have seen a number of rugged phones at this point, and because of the discreet all-black design, doesn't really scream out when you're looking at the images. But after using it and handling it, I found it to be, again, surprisingly comfortable, really slim, and quite light for a rugged device of its class. Plus, compared to almost all of the other rugged alternatives that we've mentioned previously from brands like Unihertz, Umidigi, Qbot, it seems to be a little bit more reliable when it comes to having support from the manufacturer, as well as using slightly higher end components to further complete the experience, and also not shabby when it comes to that primary 50 megapixel camera as well. So it's a pretty strong contender in my opinion if you're looking for a more impact resistant, rugged Android smartphone. Again, especially if you are based in the US, where it can be found with carriers like Verizon for a subsidized cost. You can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below. I would describe this as kind of a sleeper of a phone that has been the Sonim XP Pro 5G.